Hey, Miss Biko. Say, hey, Miss Biko. Thank you so much. That's me. And my gender pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And I would like to thank Melissa Harris Perry and Wake Forest University, the staff of Anna Julia Cooper Center, Sarah and Rulisa, I'm sorry. So much. I'm the co-chair of the Young Women's Advisory Council and one of the co-founders of Black Trans Lives Matter. And I want to give a big shout out to all of our friends watching on the live stream and my mom, and remind you all that you can join the conversation online using the hashtags Know Her Truth and She Will Be. So we want to bring you all more into this space and also bring in the people whose shoulders we stand on, or the people who made space for us. So on the count of 3, I want you to just say your name, and then we're going to count to 3 again, and I want you to say the name of someone who paved the way for you to be here today. So I'll give you an example. 1, 2, 3, Miss Biko, and then 1, 2, 3, Marsha P. Johnson. Got it? 1, 2, 3, Harriet Tubman. 1, 2, 3. No, I'm playing. Okay. So on 3, say your name. 1, 2, 3. And on 3, say the name of someone who inspired you to be here today. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much. And then I'll bring up.
Hi, everyone. Just want to introduce myself. My name is Amanda Matos. I'm from the Bronx, New York. I identify as a fierce Latina feminist. And I'm a co-chair of the Young Women's Initiative, and I'm also the founder of the Womanhood Project, which is a Bronx-based mentorship program for young girls of color directly in my community.
Hi everyone, I'm Kylynn. I go by she, her, hers, and I'm the policy coordinator at Girls for Gender Equity and a support person for the Young Women's Advisory Council in thinking about design and supporting Joanne in whatever way she needs. So.
She's so humble. Kylynn is actually the coordinator of the Young Women's Advisory Council, who, without her, as Melissa stated, without her holding so much of the clipboard, vision, production, we wouldn't even have these 2-pagers here today. So Kylynn is a big deal. And I'm Joanne Smith, and I'm the founder and executive director of Girls for Gender Equity. And a few folks I want to definitely name are Gloria Malone, who's also a Young Women's Advisory co-chair. And she's just a fierce advocate. You'll see her in some of the PowerPoint, and has really helped, especially at the White House, in naming teen moms and uplifting single moms in communities of color so that we don't pathologize their worth. So Gloria Malone is here with us today. I also want to name Anna Olivier of New York Women's Foundation and Danielle Moss-Lee of the YWCA of NYC, who are also co-chairs of the Young Women's Initiative. Lastly, Sasha Ahuja. Sasha, don't kill me. Sasha Ahuja, who, again, without her fierce vision, we wouldn't even have a Young Women's Initiative, quite honestly. So I have the role of, as the older of the group, coming in and framing, which is amazing because, one, yesterday I was at the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls, right? Everything is happening right now. Tomorrow I'll go to the UN with Black Women's Blueprint, Truth and Reconciliation for Black Women and Girls. It's all happening right now. And so as the older of the group, I get to frame, and then I get to step back. And that's a beautiful thing, not just today, but within this movement. This intergenerational work is so real. And so we're here. My gender pronouns are she and her. And I guess let's begin. And so many of you received a 2-pager, and I also tweeted from GGE NYC. If you go to that Twitter handle, you'll catch everyone's Twitter handle, and trust me, you're going to want to quote these young women. But on there, if you have not received the handout, you'll find it, assuming you have Twitter or cell phones. And so the Young Women's Advisory Council, it really was convened as experts participating in a participatory governance process. It's the Young Women's Initiative really was necessary because we needed to reclaim space and demand the needs that of young women and girls of color in New York City be centered. The speaker of the city of New York, Melissa Mark Viverito, said yes, and that we would center the needs, we would center the innovation, and have this participatory process of cis, trans, gender nonconforming young women of color of ages 12 to 14 in New York City, and that as a part of that, they would be an integral part in the planning process, from beginning to the end. Not at the end when we want to verify, is this working, or not just in the beginning when we need their stories, but throughout the entire process. So at Girls for Gender Equity, where you see fierce sisters in strength organizers, here is a photo of us standing in formation at Black Women's Blueprint Mother Tongue Monologue, where we were honored staff and our young women who were just so proud. We've been since 2001 really centering the needs and the lives of young women and girls within the community. And I mean, it's been an evolutionary process where while we hold the space for them to develop their leadership and advocacy skills, we also experiment. We also lead and follow. We also present opportunities and hear what they have to say when they say, I'm tired, I need to sit down, and all y'all need to sit down, because we just right now want time to develop our sisterhood. We want time to really take chances together, go on retreats. We do political education work and trainings. And Sisters in Strength was really the model for developing the Young Women's Advisory Council. With developing the Young Women's Advisory Council, we were really asked to hold this process. And to us, it wasn't just, well, how do you get young people to participate? It needed to be a program. It needed to be something that, one, was funded, and the New York Women's Foundation did that. They funded it so that we can do it with integrity, so that something as simple as having lunch or food at the end of the day could happen, so that if that was the only meal they ate that day, they ate that day, so that Metro cards could happen, so that space can be held, we could have supplies, and we could actually have an end of the year celebration and honor the work that had been done. And so this intergenerational framework also came because we invest in participatory action research. And as Monique has stated earlier, participatory action research, I mean, that research, just allows oftentimes communities of color to have a voice within, what is happening, how is it that they want to address what is happening, how is it that we want to take action, even naming the problem. I mean, it just means that we are the experts of our experience, and we're going to participate in this research, and we love y'all universities, we love y'all scholars. At the same time, we are experts and we are researchers as well. So this kind of problem solving led us to obviously understand that girls of color had many needs. And one of the major participatory action research projects that led to us even connecting with Monique Morris was our actually sexual harassment work. And our young people, and this was in 2008, researching 90 different public schools, community-based organizations, as well as 1,200 young people, and naming sexual harassment as an issue that impacts their day-to-day life. From there, what grew was, what are the consequences when then you react to sexual harassment, especially in school? And many times those consequences weren't named as school to prison pipeline or push out or zero tolerance policies, but we found that they had a direct connection, and especially when we were working with LGBTQ and trans youth who many times just disappeared from school, right? And so who counts the disappeared? And so we did, and we named that push out happens in many ways, and also within the research, naming how sexual harassment impacts school push out. And so our powerful communities came together, right? And while we're busy trucking along and doing the work, we in New York City, right, experienced the Young Men's Initiative. And this Young Men's Initiative starts with a $126 million investment in agencies and enterprises in addressing the needs of young men of color, right? Yeah, I see y'all shaking. Yes. And it's needed, right? We know it's needed. We know it's still a minimal amount to address the systemic issues, racism, and to address what our young men are going through. But then our president, our first black president, as we are wanting, right, blackness and the liberation, I guess, freedom song to be sung by him to address all of us, then addresses My Brother's Keeper and Men and Boys of Color with a $300 million national initiative. And for many of us, and especially many of us who were very woke, especially when Trayvon was killed, it was, we are not going to be left behind within this civil rights movement of the 21st century. Girls, women, and we're not going to wait 20, 50 years to say, okay, now trans women can come too. Like, we are all going right now, all of us right now. So, right, this weekend too, right? And so we embarked on a Why We Can't Wait campaign. And this campaign, many of you in this room have been a part of, right? And we founded this campaign with Kimberly Crenshaw, with Darnell Moore, Nikisha Lewis, with Christy Dotson, many people who burned the midnight oil to name why we can't wait and to really center girls and women of color within the racial justice movement and within all movements. Right? And so it was a group of activists. We were national and local, international, and our young people. And our young people really getting and not understanding how this can happen, really feeling hurt by it, and really wanting to take action and do something about it. So we led a town hall hearing in New York City, and it was New York City's first ever town hall hearing. There were two that happened. And with this town hall hearing, it was extremely strategic in the sense of understanding with the Why We Can't Wait campaign, we were already told that you're going to wait, and this is not going to be a priority. And if it's going to be a priority, you all should make it a priority yourselves. But two, keeping to the momentum and keeping to, I guess, building critical mass and understanding as to why it is that young women of color, and in particular black girls, need to be centered in this moment. And doing it in a way where they didn't just share their stories, they shared their expertise, their advocacy strategies. They named what they needed, right then and there. So with our town hall, I know you asked about the Philly town hall. I'll just name that we work with those young people for weeks, and still work with those young people. And those young people have become young people who lead so much of these efforts, right? It was a place where many of them found their voice for their first time, but also felt so affirmed, right? It wasn't just their story, it was their expertise. This town hall, and saying it was strategic, you see there Letitia James, and she is our public advocate of New York City, and over in the corner, and she's right behind Professor Crenshaw, over in the corner you see our city council, Lori Cumbo, and it was an understanding that with this town hall, we knew MBK was coming to New York City. With this town hall, we would also use it to demand from the mayor, right, that he include girls, women, cis and trans within this MBK initiative, and he called it My Children's Keeper. And so that was the call to action that we had that day. Lucky for us, with that call to action, the speaker's staff saw it, right? And without her, the speaker of the City Council of New York City, without her staff seeing it, we don't know that we would be here today. But they, in their office, were talking about how do we further support, as a Latina woman who has, really done incredible work in the city of New York, how do we further support young women and girls of color? And with the staff seeing this, saw that although we weren't targeting them, that they were a target, and that they actually could support and lead a process to be able to bring these visions together. And so we did that. In, I'll say, November, as the former slide said, is when we started to speak with them. 2014, develop strategy, get an idea of what local and national is doing. In March, we brought funders to the table too, and we presented a brief. Lindsay Rosenthal, I don't know if you're in the room. There she goes. So many partners, so many white comrades, allies, understanding that everybody who is about Black liberation and the liberation of girls and women of color can go, right? Everybody. And everybody has a role. And the role she played in writing the brief and supporting us was extraordinary, because she did it in like 2 hours. And so in March, in bringing funders being brave, putting skin in the game and saying, you know what, we have an investment in this, and it's an active investment, was the game changer. Because then in May, okay, between March and May, the speaker said yes. And so in May, she then named that she would lead this process in front of 2,200 people at the New York Women's Foundation breakfast. And that was so important because that named the accountability, right? So many people heard her say it, and it named, I said I would say it, I would do it, and so now I have to do it, or these people are coming for me. Because in that room are the people really doing the work. Whether we have this or not, they're going to do the work. They live doing the work. And so we were able to have this is a picture from September. We were able to have a press conference, and I love this picture because Nala is centered in this picture, and she started off with us and moved on, but such a fierce advocate that I wanted her to really be present today. And so one of the things that also was a game changer, and I don't know if Kylynn Leary is in the room.
She was, her and Teresa's flight was delayed. They were in the airport together.
Okay. They're in the airport taking selfies. I love it.
They were watching the live stream. They've been tweeting. Yeah.
Okay, so you should see yourself on here. So Kylynn Leary, Fatima, and Allison. I mean, bringing together National Women's Law Center, OSF supporting, Girls for Gender Equity led then a listening session. And this was the White House Council Women and Girls first listening session, national listening session, that really shaped, this listening session shaped then the agenda for what you have today around advancing equity on girls and women of color. And again, it was another generous, and in this picture you see Gloria, it was another generous contribution where we led with young people as experts, sharing their story and again, sharing their advocacy strategies. How could this be changed? But then the experts, advocates who do the work, just, afterwards sharing statistics and, supporting from behind, not leading it off. And so that was a real game changer because the Young Women's Initiative, again, was named by the speaker and we hadn't started yet, and advancing equity came together. So here's where the local and the national really came together. And so these stories are important. And I name them because, as the work continues, we're not going to hear so much of the grit that happened and what it took to get here today. But one piece of this story that to me is one of the most incredible, I think the most incredible is the Young Women's Advisory Council, but one of the most incredible is that this involved 200 stakeholders. One I'm looking at right now who does not stop, Andrea Ritchie, right? Who was a co-chair of the anti-violence work group. But women who, first of all, women of color led, okay? If you looked, it was a sea of women of color doing this work, 200 folks who would meet 6 to 12 times. Andrea had her group meet like 18 times. She's an outlier. Anti-violence and criminal justice, and yes, she has no chill. So they met. They're still meeting. I mean, because we understand that, as we land this report, it won't include everything. It won't have everything that we need as an advocacy strategy, but it will have a lot. And a lot of it comes from the young women, but so much of it also comes from the advocates who have done this work for 30 years and, again, would be doing this work in the city of New York regardless. And so with that, this process has really been transformational in that while we're doing something concrete, what's happening is you have 20-year-olds 14-year-olds, a 13-year-old at the table with the speaker who's going to grow up in the city of New York, having understood they've gone through this process and having strategized around how we change the culture and environment and climate in the city of New York so that young women of color actually feel like this is their home. And so with that, I want to introduce Amanda Matos, who will take it from here.
Hello. Okay, hey. My name is Amanda. My pronouns are she and hers. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm from the Bronx, New York, and my own experience growing up in the Bronx is really what led me to being a co-chair of the Young Women's Advisory Council. It took me years and years and years to finally see someone in a position of power that shared my identity and experiences as a young girl of color growing up in the Bronx. For the longest, I didn't know much about government. It took me, again, not until I was able to go into college to really understand the impact of local government, because my whole life, no one was reaching out to me. City council, I didn't see where they were at. It took me a long time to access this knowledge and resources to now be able to challenge the system from within, which I'm thrilled to share of how we do that. So what's really exciting to me, again, is that fact that the Young Women's Initiative includes me. It includes my sisters, it includes my family. We really strive to uphold a participatory governance model, which means it's not just city council or folks in government that have the power. It's the actual constituents, it's the actual democracy. So with the Young Women's Initiative, we included, of course, young women and girls of color themselves, expanding that definition and really looking at how we're including trans women of color and gender nonconforming young folks as well. We also broke into 5 different issue areas that we identified, working towards issues on education, economic development, looking at anti-violence and criminal justice, community support, and health as well. In these work groups, again, we had 2 to 5 young women of color at these tables, as well as policymakers, folks who are working in data, policy experts, direct service providers, nonprofit leaders, all with the same amount of power as the young women of color themselves. So that's the Young Women's Advisory Council. We're beautiful. And what I really want to challenge folks to think about as we continue on is how is your city or town centering young girls of color, not just as tokens, not just as storytellers, but as experts and policymakers. So by combining participatory action research with a participatory governance model, we were able to create a space where young folks, again, aren't only sharing their stories, they're also sharing their expertise on these issue areas. So we're taking an action research model and putting it into practice by, again, giving this governance to the young women, giving them the same power to decide on what policy needs to change in New York City. And as Joanne mentioned, we had someone as young as 13 advising economic policy through this council. So the young women themselves met regularly, almost every Thursday, for 6 months. And we included food, we included paid stipends above raising the minimum wage, right? So folks were compensated for their time very respectfully. And in these meetings, we held space for these young folks. We talked about our own identities and our experiences that brought us to the table. We unpacked intersectionality, and we had the young women who were serving in these different work groups talk about what are the intersections between health and criminal justice? How does economic mobility, impact education? So these young folks at a very early age were discussing these ideas that some of us now are still grappling with, and that we know folks in government don't always understand as fully as we do. The young folks also had space to really talk about ageism. I feel like we've strived so far in talking about the intersections of race and gender, but what about age? How are we even perpetuating ageism in the spaces that we're carving out for young folks? And so by holding this space, we gave the young women the floor to really debrief what it was like working with city council members and policymakers, and even the working group co-chairs. And so by hearing their experiences of ageism through this process, we were able to challenge the entire initiative steering committee to work on 4 key practices that I'm excited to share with you. One practice, as folks were developing what the policy recommendations were for each group, we called adoptmocracy. So oftentimes folks would vote on which policy recommendations should be given to the final blueprint. And so we made sure that when folks were voting, that while each group member had 3 dots to vote, the young women had 9 or had 12 votes, making their vote count more than the older folks in the space. We also implemented a 24 and under rule. So during these work group meetings, when anybody who's 24 or under wanted to speak, they had the floor. As simple as that. We also made sure that the working group co-chairs met with the Young Women's Advisory Council members prior to many of the meetings in order to help prep the agenda with their experiences and expertise in mind, also giving the young women extra time to prepare, knowing that young folks are managing school and jobs and this experience. And lastly, a key piece of the Young Women's Initiative is that we had our local city agencies participate as well. So this includes departments and agencies that oversee our education system, that oversee the criminal justice system. So while we gave those folks space to present to us, we also gave the young women of color a space to present to each work group on what they felt were the top priorities tied to health, tied to education, and we valued their presentations the same way as the city agencies and adult experts in this work. And so again, another question for y'all to think about is how are you pushing back against ageism with the young folks you're working with? So really what drove the Young Women's Advisory Council are a few core values that we want to share with all of you today and prompt you on how you're thinking about this work. So what was most important is for us to push back against white mainstream feminism. We took an intersectional approach, recognizing again the intersections between race, gender, age, class, education, and so many other identities that we carry with us as young women of color. And in order to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, we really decided that in order to uphold an intersectional feminist lens, we need to move away from the deficit model that says that we're not good, right? How can we focus on our own strengths and our expertise? And so by moving away from a deficit model, we made sure that we recognize the solutions to all these problems are within the community themselves. The young women have the solutions. We don't need to create them themselves. And so this ties again directly to, active youth participation, always centering the young folks in the space, always hearing what they had to say, and giving them the power to make many final decisions of this entire process. And then there's visibility. And visibility is very complicated. Because for us, we tried our best to have a cross-section of girls of color that represent all of New York City, but that was impossible, right? In order to really show the ethnic diversity, the class diversity, and the experiences, we have a lot of work left to do, but we still strove to make sure that the Young Women's Advisory Council was as diverse as it could be. And because that was a shortcoming, looking at how can we become more diverse, we decided to use the folks we had and help them empower themselves to think about, as a young person, how can I practice allyship? So what this meant was for folks who are in working group spaces, we encouraged them to bring the stories of undocumented folks into the room. How is healthcare impacting undocumented people? And how can we talk about those issues if we are citizens? How can we be allies at the age of 16? Similarly, we also talked about visibility of oftentimes there were just a bunch of cis women in the room. How can we center our trans sisters if they're not represented in the space in a thoughtful and honest way? Part 2 about visibility is reclaiming space. As you saw in the previous photo, we're in City Hall. So every Thursday, not only did 200 people come into City Hall, to take over, but there was about 30 young women of color coming to City Hall almost every Thursday, disrupting in the most powerful way possible. And so that was important to us because we were reclaiming a space that is often meant to marginalize us, that often takes away our rights. And by showing up, we're able to show the council members, hey, we mean business and we're here to be active constituents in New York City. And so now I'm going to call up Ms. Biko to co-team with me to talk more about accountability.
Can I use this one? How's this one? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, visibility is so important. I always think about the Audre Lorde quote where she says, visibility, although it makes us so vulnerable, it's the source of our greatest strength. But I'm really interested in moving us out of this ivory tower, away from all of this language that people out in the street don't understand, and really how we can transform this visibility into power, how we can transform the visibility into accountability, right? So we're asking ourselves the questions, who are we answering to? Are we accountable to our members? Are we accountable to our funders? Who do we have to answer to at the end of the day? And then how can we hold ourselves more accountable? So one of the things that I was struggling with on my way here is that I felt like our co-chair Gloria Malone should really be here. And Gloria Malone is a teen mother. And so if we want to engage teen mothers in our work, some of the things that we had to process through was we can't have meetings when people picking their kids up from school. Okay, we can't have meetings, or if people need childcare, we should be able to provide those things. If somebody can't make it somewhere without their baby, they need childcare and an extra ticket. And so that's something that we're like struggling with and struggling through, because we are accountable to the young women who we're serving. So shout out to Gloria Malone. Next time, boo, I got you. Oh, where's the clicker? Okay. So another question we had to ask ourselves, I think we call them gaps in here. Where are the gaps, right? So the gaps were that we couldn't get trans women and we couldn't get undocumented women in the room. So while it's like really cute to say, oh, we met at City Hall isn't actually accessible to everybody. Okay, so if you're an undocumented trans woman, when you try to get into City Hall, what do they ask you for? Your ID. I don't have ID. Then you have to go through security. You want to talk about trauma. You want to talk about triggers and how trans women and gender nonconforming people and undocumented people are often over-policed in these institutions. So how I got started with the Young Women's Advisory Council is I was showing up at City Hall organizing around the human trafficking intervention courts. And so it's about human trafficking and diversion programs. I love the sister who said there are many ways to be behind bars, because as we get smarter and as we begin to organize around these issues that affect us, this system is getting smarter too. And they're figuring out we don't actually have to put you behind bars. We can just increase your interactions with the criminal justice legal system by making you pay probation fees or having to see parole officers or being mandated to these programs. And they said, Ms. Biko, please come outside out of the rain. And when Nala was unable to continue, I stepped into her position as co-chair. And I'm so happy, but there's been a long history of trans and gender nonconforming organizing happening specifically in New York City. And I always talk about Marsha P. Johnson and Miss Major Griffin Gracie, because in 1969 at the Stonewall Rebellions, the police came in to raid the club again, and they separated people. So all the men would have to get on this side, and all the women would have to get on this side. And again, you'd have to present your ID. And if you didn't have on 3 articles of clothing that matched the sex that was listed on your ID, then you were going to jail for falsification or impersonation of genders. It sounds kind of similar to HB2, right? We'll come back to it. Marsha and Sylvia in 1969, 1970 started a group called STAR, Street Trans Action Revolutionaries. And they were pushing back around this decriminalization, and they were pushing back around the incarceration of Black and brown trans women and the abuse that we face. And they did sex work to fund the movement. And I think that it's important to name, because a lot of times trans and undocumented people and gender nonconforming people don't have access to the money that 501c3s do, right? Which is not all bad, because if we did, maybe we wouldn't be so turned up. In 2010, I first came to New York City and was organizing around the murder of Alon Nettles. That's when I first met Nala and Octavia Lewis, who's the co-chair of the Health Working Group. And when we started asking ourselves about where the trans women were and where the undocumented women were, we had to say, if we can't get them to come here, then we have to meet folks where they are. So we held focus groups that were specific to the people who were missing from the conversation. And over 20 participants provided feedback and policy and program recommendations on the report that you'll see next week. And so I'll go out to the next slide, but there were a few themes that came out of that we'll talk about later. One of the ones that's most important is the urgency. Why I say we need to get it out of this ivory tower and out into the streets where the people are is because last year was our deadliest year on record. 20 Black, trans, and gender nonconforming women were murdered in this country. And so there's a great urgency because lives are at stake here. In Charlotte, North Carolina, in October, there was a young Black trans woman. Her name was Deanna Mason. She was 22 years old. And she was walking down the street in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a police officer hit her with his patrol car and ran over her body, and he is on desk duty. And so there really is an attack on our lives. It feels like we're at war, right? And so we must include trans and gender nonconforming and Black people in our research initiatives, and not just include them, but empower them to lead them themselves, right? Because we are the own experts of our lives. One of the things that we focused on in the focus groups was the connection between the different working groups. So we had 5, health and anti-violence and community support and development. But one thing that I love that came out of the focus groups we held was the connection between the different intersections that we face, right? So one of the trans women in the focus group talked about how you can go into any city agency and there are condoms available, because the Department of Health resources millions of condoms to our communities for HIV prevention, right? But then as soon as you leave, the Department of Justice can pick you up, and those condoms can be evidence of prostitution or sex work. And so we want to talk about the ways in which they're connected. Another way was if you're trans or undocumented and you don't have ID, you probably you can't cash this check that we want to give you, and you also probably don't have a bank account. So with the focus groups, we passed out Visa gift cards so people can have their incentives and their money right away, which is important. Also, yeah, that's it.
And so, this mic is so much better. And so as we really think about the practices that we've learned from the young women on the advisory council and how that was really put into practice, Ms. Biko already gave an example. As we think about condoms as evidence, we really decided to then center these experiences and include them in the stories as we move forward with the blueprint. Another example that I'd like to offer is from our health working group. So health is a huge issue, connects a lot to young folks of color, and there was an interesting moment where working group members proposed an idea to have a fund in New York City that would provide contraception access. It sounded like a solid idea as we're thinking about people's empowerment when it comes to reproductive health. However, this fund was going to focus mostly on LARCs, on long-acting reversible contraception. Knowing the history and the impact and the triggers of forced sterilization on women of color in the United States and globally, that really elicited a lot of pain and questions that the young women had. If we're going to have a final blueprint that's promoting LARCs for young girls of color, what does that really mean? So it was the voices of the young women themselves in the health working group that raised up and shared these stories and these truths. And now in the final blueprint, we're looking at an overall contraception fund that's not focusing on LARCs, but it's focusing on young folks having that access to the choice that they deserve on what kind of contraception works best for them. So with these two examples, it was the young women themselves who raised these issues to the working group members and said, wait, this can't go on. We need to make sure that our lived experiences are in these final policy recommendations. And so as we're thinking about our final blueprint, which is going to be released next Thursday, May 5th, we want to share now some next steps so y'all can hear more about what we're doing and how y'all can even bring this to your own cities.
So as the Young Women's Initiative community and Young Women's Advisory Council community, we're really excited about, as the work continues, some of the next steps that are going to be happening. One of the major ones is the blueprint that's been mentioned a couple of times, which will offer up policy and program recommendations, and the official release, crossing fingers, is next week on Thursday. And that'll be a publicly made, a report that's publicly available. And then some of the other really exciting pieces, actually, I'm going to go into this. One of the really exciting outcomes about this overall process has been a fiscal commitment. And so the Speaker of City Council has committed $5 million in conjunction with the Philanthropic Roundtable, and it'll make for a total of $10 million over 2 years to programs that are specifically centering women and girls of color. 20 million. And some of the other work that's happening that we're really excited at Girls for Gender Equity, we've been partnering with a few folks, including City Council, on mapping what are the areas in New York City that have nonprofit presence that are centering the needs of women and girls of color, and where those resources are available. And that will actually come out in June, and we're really excited about that. And it'll come out in conjunction with our Young Women's Advisory Council report, which will offer up some pieces, outcomes, some learned practices from the Young Women's Advisory Council and sort of this overall process. And so those are some pieces that we're really excited about. And I heard, especially Philadelphia, talking about all the work that they're doing, right? And we know that this work is happening all across the states in different municipalities and rural and urban areas. And what does it look like for us to continue this conversation in room 401A for the first 30 minutes of lunch? If you're interested in doing a power map and starting to think through maybe what this could look like in your community, or if you have any questions that you'd like to continue to ask us, we're here, we're available. And we are also available by email. So thank you all for your time.